Either they've made a stupid decision and they need to update it and fix it, or they know something that you don't and now you know it too. And a lot of you being able to build the scope that you're able to work in is... It eventually happens to everyone, whether you're a year in, 2 years, you've had that experience of just, wow, I'm getting so good at coding every single week, it's palpable. You can feel that you're solving things faster, the solutions are more novel, you're refactoring a lot quicker, and everything just feels like it's coming together. Eventually, that rapid improvement has to start declining, and eventually it just levels off to the point that months will pass and you just feel, wow, am I in the same place I was 6 months ago? Have I not improved in a year? You're working every day, so... surely you must be getting better, but you want to have that same experience. You want to feel like things are actually improving and you can notice it. Well, this is exactly where I was at, and I remember a senior software developer that I was working with at the time gave me a piece of advice that completely reversed that feeling. And if you want any motivation for this, well, maybe here it is. How do you go from mid-level to senior if you're not improving? It's just not going to happen. Your job normally reflects your capacity and the kind of responsibilities that you can encumber, and if you're not still improving, then you're just not going to be able to take on those extra responsibilities on top of what you're already doing. So then the best person to ask this kind of question to, of how do I keep improving from mid-level and up, well, it's the person in the position that you want to be in, which is a senior at your company. And this advice, I don't think, will just apply to mid-levels. It will apply to everybody at every level, because there's a good chance that you haven't heard of this. So I sat down in a meeting and I asked the question, what, looking back, actually got you to where you are now? Their advice was really simple, and you definitely know that this is something you should be doing, but maybe you're not prioritizing it. And it's doing pull requests, code reviews. And I think a lot of people just see it as a chore, part of the workday that, you have to get out of the way so that your colleagues can move on to a new task, but it's not something that you really are looking forward to. But what I want you to do is actually see it for the opportunity that it is. You're getting exposure to different coding styles, patterns. If you're doing it properly, you're looking at the decisions that developer made, and the chances are they're going to be coming to decisions that you might not have thought of. And maybe while reading it, you'll think, why has this person made this decision? This doesn't make any sense to me. And that is going to identify to you a gap in your knowledge. And if you then ask that person, why did you make this decision? There's two routes, right? Either they've made a stupid decision and they need to update it and fix it, or they know something that you don't and now you know it too. And a lot of you being able to build the scope that you're able to work in is having a larger view of the context that your company works with it. And you can only work on so much of the code base. But when you're reviewing, you can quickly flick through so much more that you otherwise never would have looked at, because it's not relevant to whatever piece of work you're currently assigned to. By increasing the volume of code reviews that you're engaged with, you're getting that big picture view of the system, whether you work for one of those companies where it's one monolithic application and you've never seen certain sides of it because you just happen not to have worked in those areas, or whether you're at a company with a bunch of greenfield projects where actually it will pay to have some eyes on it, because if somebody's sick or somebody leaves, you can be like, oh, actually, I am familiar with that particular project. Now, what do you actually learn from PRs specifically? Well, you might be sat there thinking, well, I do my learning on YouTube or a learning website like Code Academy or Pluralsight, which is fine. You're right. That is going to be a good way to learn more novel tools that you can apply at work. But I think what the difficulty is with kind of just broadly trying to learn more about your language. Let's say you're a C# developer and you're like, oh, I'm going to take a mid-level to advanced course on that particular language. Well, the problem is sure, you can learn a whole myriad of tools, but how relevant are they to what you actually do at your company? I'll give you an example. A lot of tech companies aren't using the latest version of .NET, which, for reference, the one that I currently work in is version 5, and I think currently the latest version is version 10. So we're 5 versions behind. So I could go and watch a nice up-to-date course on the latest C# coding tricks, but it's not really going to affect me day-to-day at work, because a lot of them I'm not actually going to be able to implement because they're just simply not in the language that we're coding in. And once you actually start looking in the broader context of your tech stack in its entirety, how often are you coming across tutorials that are using your specific tech stack that you use at work? There's so much variation that it's quite unlikely that you're finding good quality information on exactly the same tech stack that you're using. But where you can find new information that's relevant and you can learn is, a senior's code review. If you're a mid-level and there's a senior pushing out code and you can look at as much of that as possible, you're going to start seeing things that separate them from you. And once you learn them, well, you're closing that gap. And what you're also doing is you're exercising that muscle of just reading code. Because fundamentally, when you write code, you're having to check what you've done anyway and read back. And if you're improving your ability to identify issues, because fundamentally in a code review, that's what you're doing, you're thinking less about how you're going to write something and more about how it's already been written. It just means that when you actually finish your work item and you look through it and you go, oh, yeah, shit, there's issues here, here, and here. And when you push it up for code review, people are less likely to pick up on problems because you've already looked through and found them. So what are some good tips for actually doing PRs? Well, the first thing you want to do, it's, the thing that you probably struggled with when you were in school. RTFQ, read the fucking question. It's so easy to get caught up in the nuance and the minutiae of the code, the algorithms, you know, the patterns used to solve the problem, but if the problem being solved doesn't reflect what the task actually wanted, then, you know, it's failed from the get-go. And we're not here to write, you know, perfect code. We're here to provide the solution that the business is looking for within their constraints. And if that's a time constraint, sometimes sacrifices have to be made. You don't want to refactor an entire area of the system just so that it's perfect code when, you know, the thing needs to be out the door in a couple of weeks and you only have so much time. Another thing worth doing is, instead of actually just leaving a comment as and when you find something that you're not too sure about, just ask the person. Send them a message, be like, oh, by the way, looking through your PR, before I leave a comment, I don't quite understand this bit here. And then if you're right, leave the comment and the person's aware and it's done, because there's a good chance that, especially if you're starting to look at senior members of your team's work, that you might be wrong and they might be right. And a good way of checking that is just to ask. They're not going to mind, because either way, if you left a comment, then they're going to have to go solve it anyway. It's probably easier for them to respond to a message than it is to check their emails, go, oh, somebody's left me a comment on my PR, go check it. I think the main tip that you need to take away, and what actually ties into less, okay, doing the PR, but using the PR as a tool to become better, is that when you come across, like I said, new patterns, decisions that you weren't quite aware of, but, you know, once you've spoken to the person, you have a better understanding, take notes. Actually try and write it down so that you're storing it and you've learnt something. If you've got it in a place that you can come back to, that, I don't know, maybe it's in the form of a mind map. Mind maps aren't terrible for adults, because the beauty of it is that you just look at it and it's like, oh, this is relevant to algorithms. Here's my notes on algorithms. Oh yeah, I have looked at this before. It was in a PR, and here's a good way of doing that. To give you an example, I was dealing with some particularly difficult asynchronous coding where we had a lot of things all going on at once, and it was blocking the UI thread, and we had to make sure that all of these different items had finished at the same time before we could proceed with the application. But that meant a lot of different classes all working together and getting the same result at the same time. And I did it with the toolkit that I'd always been using at this particular company. And while I was working on that task, a senior had put up a pull request, and I went and had a look, and they were doing something similar with aligning asynchronous calls, because we knew that it was a problem at the time. There were multiple tasks to do with it. And I had a look, and he was using something called a semaphore slim, which is a type of object in C# that allows you to quite neatly pull together a bunch of different asynchronous calls and make sure they all finish at the same time. If I'd just been left to my own devices finishing that, I would have written a far more complicated and less elegant solution. But because I'd actually had a look at what the guy was doing and then paid attention and thought, what here is new? Oh, this is new. Let's look into how that works. It meant then that the task that I was working on, I was able to solve far faster. And it wasn't even about speed. It was about the fact that I understood it in a completely different way, because I suddenly had a new toolkit to deal with the problem. Another example of this was, well, we actually also have some projects that are separate to our main one. And I'd made sure that I looked at all the PRs relevant to it, because fundamentally my work was not going anywhere near it. There were other members of the team that were prioritized to working on this new project. And unfortunately, one of those members of the team left, and suddenly they were like, oh, we need somebody else on the team to start picking up this project. And looking around, had I not actually stepped up and done that, there would have been nobody with any familiarity with that system at all. But because I had done the PRs, I was like, oh, well, actually, you know, I've gone through half of the work items that are relevant to that project. I've got a pretty good understanding of it. Throw it my way. And that's what I mean by increasing scope. Think about how much time the business would have had to invest into me learning the architecture of that new system, getting familiar enough that I can make changes without affecting or breaking things that I'm not aware of. That's a huge saving. And they're going to take notice of that. Your manager's going to take notice of that. So the takeaway is just actually start prioritizing, looking through the code reviews, and give it the attention it deserves, because it might be the thing that levels you up. Now, just because you're improving doesn't necessarily mean that you're not doing things that could be massively hindering your career. And I've actually recently made a video where I point out something that I don't think many people are noticing is stopping them from getting promoted, and might actually be leading to you losing your job, especially with the tech layoffs. So if you click this video here, I'll talk you through that. Hopefully it helps. Cheers.